It began where no beginning should have been permitted. Beyond the mapped edges of the Imperium, past the reach of astropathic clarity and the brittle authority of dying stars, there drifted a fragment that did not belong. It did not travel as debris travels, nor did it tumble as matter is meant to tumble through the silent arithmetic of void and gravity. It moved with a strange and ancient intention, as though guided by a will long forgotten by the cosmos itself. It was a stone, so it would be named by those who later witnessed its descent, but such a word was an insult to its nature. Its surface bore neither the erosion of time nor the scars of stellar birth. It was smooth in places where no friction had touched it, jagged where no force had struck it. Its color shifted subtly, not with light, but with something beneath light, as if it reflected a sky that no longer existed. For ages uncounted, it had traveled. It passed through regions of void where entire civilizations had burned and been erased without memory. It crossed the remnants of warp storms whose echoes still whispered madness into the minds of those who dared listen. Yet it was untouched. The Imperium recoiled from it, not in fear, but in confusion, as though it could not decide what it was witnessing. On a distant, withering world designated only by an administrative cipher long buried in forgotten archives, the stone found its destination. The planet was a graveyard of industry and devotion. Its skies were choked with ash and the residue of 1,000 manufactorums that had long since ceased to produce anything of worth. The air carried the weight of prayers spoken without hope, rituals performed without understanding. The people who remained lived not as citizens, but as remnants, thin shadows clinging to the ruins of obedience. Above this world, the stone altered its course. No force acted upon it, yet its path curved with quiet certainty, descending through layers of polluted atmosphere. The clouds did not part. They seemed instead to shrink away, as though unwilling to touch what approached. Lightning flickered across the sky, not in reaction but in hesitation, each flash stuttering as if reality itself struggled to process the intrusion. The first to see it were the watchers stationed upon the skeletal towers that ringed the dead manufactorum plains. They had been placed there generations ago, their purpose long since diluted into ritual. They watched because they had always watched. They recorded because the act of recording had become a prayer. Through lenses clouded with age and neglect, they observed the descent. At first, they believed it to be a falling star, a sign perhaps, though whether of salvation or annihilation, none could say. Such distinctions had long lost their meaning. But as it drew closer, the watchers found their certainty eroding. Stars did not move like this. Stars did not seem to choose. The stone slowed as it approached the surface, defying the brutal logic of gravity that governed all else. It hovered for a single, suspended moment above the broken plains, casting no shadow, emitting no heat. The world held its breath, though no living thing could name why. Then it fell. The impact did not roar. It did not shatter the land with explosive force. Instead, it sank into the earth as though the ground itself had yielded, accepting it not as an intruder, but as something long awaited. The tremor that followed was deep and resonant, a vibration that traveled not only through soil and stone, but through something less tangible, something that lay beneath the perception of those who would later attempt to measure it. Miles away, within the hollowed remains of a shrine dedicated to a forgotten saint, a priest collapsed mid-chant. His voice, which had recited the same litany for decades without deviation, faltered for the first time. His eyes widened, not with understanding, but with the absence of it. He felt something stir not within the world, but within the concept of the world. Elsewhere, in the shadows of a derelict command bastion, a sanctioned psyker screamed. His handlers silenced him quickly, as they had been trained to do. But the scream lingered, echoing through corridors of rust and bone. He had glimpsed the Imperium, as all psychers did. Yet what he had seen was not the writhing chaos they had been taught to endure. It had been still. For a fraction of a moment, the warp had paused, and within that pause, there had been something else, something that did not belong to its tides or its hungers, something that existed apart, untouched, and utterly unafraid. At the sight of the impact, the ground settled slowly, reluctantly sealing around the embedded stone. No crater marked its arrival, No fire scarred the land. It was as though the planet itself had conspired to conceal the event, to bury it beneath layers of denial and dust. Yet concealment could not erase presence. Beneath the surface, where no light could reach, the stone rested. Time which had no meaning to it passed. Then, without warning or herald, a sound emerged from within. It was not loud. It did not shake the earth or echo through the caverns that surrounded it. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a faint crack, like the splitting of ancient ice. But it carried with it a weight that no sound should possess. The crack widened. Hairline fractures spread across the surface of the stone, glowing faintly with a light that was neither warm nor cold. The illumination pulsed, not with energy, but with rhythm, steady, deliberate, alive. From within, something shifted. Not a creature as the Imperium would define it, not a daemon, nor a machine, nor any amalgamation of flesh and artifice known to the countless horrors catalogued across the stars. This was something older, something that had once defied heavens. The cracks deepened, branching like veins across the stone's impossible surface. With each fracture, the faint glow intensified, seeping outward into the surrounding darkness. And then, from within the sealed silence of buried earth, there came a sound that had not been heard in that universe before. A breath. It was followed, after a moment that stretched far beyond its measure, by something far more dangerous. A laugh. Not loud, not wild, but certain. As though whatever lay within the stone had awakened not into confusion or fear, but into recognition. As though it had arrived exactly where it intended to be. The sound did not fade. It lingered beneath the surface, threading through the buried strata like a quiet defiance of silence itself. The earth above the stone remained still, yet something fundamental had shifted. What had once been inert was now aware, and that awareness did not sleep. The faint glow within the fractures intensified, no longer a mere pulse but a gathering presence. Each line of light spread with deliberate patience, carving through the stone as though guided by unseen hands. The cracks did not splinter chaotically. They formed patterns, ancient, purposeful, almost ritualistic. Beneath miles of lifeless soil, the stone was opening. The breath came again, deeper this time, drawn not from air but from existence itself. It was the inhale of something that had once known skies beyond measure, something that remembered horizons no longer present in this decaying universe. With it came a subtle tremor, not of destruction, but of arrival. Above, the world began to react, though it could not understand why. Machines long thought dead flickered with momentary life. Rusted conduits sparked with phantom energy before falling silent once more. In the ruins of manufactorums, gears turned a fraction of an inch, only to halt as if ashamed of their motion. The planet, in its dying inertia, shuddered at a presence it could neither reject nor accept. The watchers upon their towers felt it next. They could not see beneath the ground, nor could their instruments detect anything beyond the ordinary decay they had long recorded. Yet a disquiet settled over them, a subtle distortion in the rhythm of thought. Their prayers faltered again, syllables forgotten mid-utterance, replaced by a silence heavy with unasked questions. One among them, older than the rest, removed his viewing lens. He did not know why. His eyes, clouded by age and devotion, turned toward the distant plains where the stone had fallen. He saw nothing, only ash, only ruin, and yet he felt as though something gazed back, not with malice, not with hunger, with curiosity. Beneath the surface, the fractures deepened. A shard of stone shifted, then another. The sound was soft, almost delicate, as though the prison that had endured for ages was now yielding willingly. There was no violence in its breaking, no forceful eruption. It was a release, measured and inevitable. Light spilled through the widening gaps, illuminating a form within. At first it was indistinct, a suggestion rather than a shape, but as the stone continued to part, the outline became clearer. Limbs, coiled with dormant strength. A torso marked not by armor, but by something far older than protection. A face, still obscured, yet already bearing the weight of expression. The being within stirred. Its fingers moved first, flexing slowly as though reacquainting themselves with motion. The gesture was simple, almost idle, yet it carried an echo of something immeasurable. The surrounding earth responded, compacting slightly, as though pressed by an invisible force. The hand pressed against the inner surface of the stone. For a moment, there was stillness. Then, with effortless certainty, it pushed. The remaining shell fractured completely, not exploding outward, but dissolving into fragments that fell away like dust. The earth around it parted just enough to allow the figure to rise, as though the world itself acknowledged the futility of resistance. He emerged into darkness. There was no sky to greet him, no light to mark his ascent, only the dense, suffocating weight of buried soil and ancient ruin. Yet he did not hesitate. His movements were fluid, unhurried, as though he had done this before in some distant, forgotten age. His eyes opened. They did not blaze with fire, nor did they glow with unnatural power. They were clear, sharp, and impossibly aware. In them was not confusion, nor fear, nor even wonder. There was recognition. He inhaled again, deeper now, and this time the breath carried sound. A low exhale followed, almost contemplative, as though tasting the nature of the world he had entered. Then he smiled. It was not a cruel expression, nor a kind one. It was something far more dangerous, a smile born of certainty, of a being who had never learned the meaning of limitation. He moved upward. The earth above him resisted for a fraction of a moment before yielding entirely. Soil shifted, stone cracked, and the buried weight of the world parted in a narrow path. He ascended through it with ease, his form cutting through layers of decay as though they were nothing more than mist. When he broke the surface, the sky greeted him with ash and dying light. He stood upon the broken plains, the remnants of his stone prison scattered around him in lifeless fragments. For a moment he said nothing. He simply looked. The world stretched before him in all its ruined towers crumbling into dust, machines silent in their eternal failure, and a sky that seemed to have forgotten the concept of dawn. It was a place of endings, a realm where hope had long since been consumed by the machinery of survival. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering. Then, without warning, he laughed. The sound was clear and unrestrained, cutting through the stagnant air like a blade through cloth. It carried no madness, no despair. It was pure, unyielding amusement, as though the very nature of this world had presented him with a challenge too absurd to ignore. Far above, the watchers froze. They heard it not through instruments, not through transmission, but directly, as though the sound had chosen them. Their bodies tensed, their thoughts faltered, and for the first time in their lives, they felt something their faith had never prepared them for: uncertainty. On the plains below, the figure took a single step forward. The ground did not crack beneath him. It did not tremble or yield. Instead, it seemed to accept his presence, as though acknowledging a force it could not measure. He glanced at his hand, flexing his fingers once more, then looked toward the distant horizon where the ruins of civilization clawed weakly at the sky. "Strange," he murmured, his voice calm, almost thoughtful. It was the first word spoken in that place that did not belong to prayer, command, or despair, and it carried with it the quiet promise of something the universe had long since forgotten: defiance. The laughter faded, but its echo did not. It lingered in the still air, clinging to the broken plains as though unwilling to be forgotten. The figure stood where he had emerged, his gaze sweeping slowly across the horizon, measuring not distance, but meaning. There was no urgency in him, no instinct to rush or retreat. The world before him, for all its decay, was something to be understood before it was acted upon. He took another step. The ash beneath his feet shifted softly, disturbed by a presence that did not belong to its endless cycle of erosion. Each movement carried a quiet certainty, as though the act of walking itself was an assertion of will rather than a necessity of motion. Above, the sky churned in muted grays and dying embers. It was not a sky that invited wonder. It did not stretch infinitely with promise, nor did it cradle stars that whispered of distant realms. It hung low, oppressive, a ceiling rather than an expanse. Whatever this world had once been, it had long since turned its gaze downward. He noticed. His eyes lifted briefly, studying the clouded firmament. There was no recognition there, only a faint curiosity, quickly dismissed. Whatever the sky had meant here, it no longer held power. The ground spoke more clearly. As he moved further from the site of his awakening, the ruins began to take shape. Structures rose from the plains like the bones of something long dead, their forms rigid and unnatural. Towers leaned at impossible angles, their surfaces etched with symbols worn thin by time. Pathways of cracked stone cut through the dust, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. There were signs of life, though they were not immediately visible. A faint vibration traveled through the ground, subtle enough to escape notice by most, yet unmistakable to something attuned to presence rather than appearance. It was not the pulse of nature, nor the rhythm of machinery. It was repetition. He followed it. The path led him toward one of the larger structures, its outer walls fractured but still standing. Openings lined its surface windows perhaps, though their purpose had long since been reduced to form rather than function. From within, the vibration grew clearer, resolving into sound. Voices, low, synchronized, stripped of individuality. They rose and fell in measured cadence, repeating phrases that carried no variation, no deviation. It was not speech in the way he understood it. It was ritual. He paused at the threshold. Inside, figures knelt in rows, their forms thin and rigid, their movements precise to the point of lifelessness. Their faces were obscured by shadow, yet their posture revealed everything. They did not bow in reverence, they bowed in obligation. Each word they uttered seemed less a choice than a requirement imposed by something unseen. He listened. The language was unfamiliar, yet its intent was not. It spoke of devotion, of service, of an authority so distant it had become abstract. It spoke of suffering not as a condition to be escaped, but as a state to be preserved. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. He stepped inside. The sound of his movement was slight, barely enough to disturb the air, yet the effect was immediate. The voices faltered, their perfect synchronization breaking for the first time. One figure hesitated, then another. The rhythm collapsed into uncertainty. Slowly, they turned. Their faces were pale, marked by exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Their eyes, when they met his, held no anger, no curiosity, only confusion, as though they were struggling to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught to expect. He regarded them in silence. For a moment, neither side moved. The air grew heavy with something unspoken, a tension that had no clear origin. It was not hostility, it was not fear. It was the absence of understanding. One of the figures rose. The motion was stiff, practiced, as though standing had become as ritualized as kneeling. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the stranger before him. There was authority in his posture, but it was fragile, sustained more by habit than conviction. "You are not sanctioned," he said. The words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of doctrine. They were not a question, nor an accusation. They were a declaration of fact, spoken with the expectation that reality would conform to it. The figure who had emerged from the stone tilted his head slightly. "Sanctioned," he repeated, as though testing the shape of the word. There was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet curiosity that made the statement itself seem uncertain. The man hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The certainty that had defined his voice wavered, disrupted by something he could not name. He took another step forward, as though proximity might restore his conviction. "All things are accounted for," he continued. "All beings are judged. You stand outside that order." A faint smile touched the stranger's expression. "Then it is a small order," he said. The words settled into the space between them, simple and unadorned. Yet they carried a weight that the man could not deflect. It was not defiance in the way he understood it. It was something quieter, more absolute, a dismissal of the very framework he relied upon. The room shifted, not physically, but in perception. The kneeling figures remained where they were, yet their stillness no longer felt stable. Something had been introduced into their world that did not align with its structure, and the structure itself was beginning to strain. The man's hand moved toward his side, where a device rested, an instrument of authority, though its function was secondary to its symbolism. His fingers hovered over it, uncertain. "You will submit," he said, though the words lacked the certainty they once held. The stranger's gaze followed the motion briefly before returning to the man's face. "Submit," he echoed. The smile widened, not in amusement, but in recognition. "No," he said simply. The refusal did not echo. It did not need to. It settled into the room with a finality that no argument could displace. Outside, the sky remained unchanged, its oppressive weight pressing down upon a world that had long since forgotten how to look upward. But within the crumbling structure, something had shifted. For the first time in an age, measured not in years but in surrender, the idea of refusal existed. And it did not feel impossible. The word did not vanish when spoken. It remained, suspended in the air like a fracture in something unseen, widening with each passing heartbeat. No one in the chamber moved at first. The refusal had not been loud, nor forceful, yet it carried a finality that unsettled the fragile order holding the room together. The man standing before him felt it most. His hand, still hovering over the device at his side, trembled slightly. Not from fear, though something akin to it stirred beneath his practiced composure, but from the unfamiliar sensation of doubt. The world he understood did not permit such responses. Defiance existed, but it was always contained, always crushed beneath the certainty of consequence. This was different. "You do not understand," the man said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "There is no outside. There is only compliance or correction." The stranger regarded him without hostility, without urgency. His gaze was steady, almost patient, as though he had heard such declarations before in forms long since reduced to memory. "And if I choose neither?" he asked. The question was not rhetorical. It was genuine, spoken with the quiet curiosity of someone testing the limits of a system he did not yet accept as real. The man hesitated again. That hesitation broke something. Around them, the kneeling figures shifted. It was subtle, barely a movement, but it spread through the rows like a ripple through still water. Their eyes flickered between the two figures, drawn not by authority, but by uncertainty. The rhythm that had defined their existence had been interrupted, and in that interruption something else began to take shape. The man noticed. His expression hardened, not with conviction, but with necessity. His hand closed around the device at his side and drew it free. It was a compact instrument, its surface etched with symbols of sanction and control. A faint hum emanated from it as it activated, the sound cutting cleanly through the lingering silence. "Non-compliance will be corrected," he said. This time, the words were not a declaration of belief, but an attempt to restore it. The stranger's gaze dropped briefly to the device, then returned to the man's face. There was no tension in his posture, no preparation for conflict. He stood as he had before, relaxed, unguarded, as though the concept of threat had not yet presented itself in a meaningful way. "Corrected," he repeated softly. The man stepped forward. The device in his hand emitted a sharp pulse, a focused discharge of energy designed not to kill but to subdue, to break resistance without ending it. It moved faster than the eye could follow, a streak of pale light cutting through the dim interior. It struck. For a fraction of a moment, the chamber held its breath. Then the light dispersed. Not deflected, not absorbed. It simply ceased, unraveling at the point of contact as though it had encountered something that refused to acknowledge its existence. The stranger had not moved. He looked down at his chest, where the energy had touched him, then back at the man. His expression remained unchanged, though a faint narrowing of his eyes suggested something new, not pain, not anger, but interest. "That was meant to do something," he observed. The man's grip tightened. He fired again. This time, the pulse was stronger, its hum rising to a sharper pitch as it cut through the air. It struck the same point, and again, it vanished not with resistance but with irrelevance, as though the laws governing its function did not apply. A murmur spread through the kneeling figures. It was not loud, not yet, but it carried a weight that had not been present before. They were witnessing something that did not align with the boundaries of their understanding, and the certainty that had defined their world began to erode. The man saw it happening. His composure fractured. "You will submit," he shouted, the words no longer controlled, no longer measured. He raised the device once more, pushing it beyond its intended limits. The hum deepened, straining as though the instrument itself resisted the demand placed upon it. The air around it distorted, the energy building to a level it had not been designed to sustain. The stranger watched. There was no fear in his gaze, no anticipation of harm, only a quiet awareness, as though he were observing a process rather than participating in it. When the discharge came, it was no longer precise. It erupted outward in a surge of unstable force, filling the space between them with a blinding flash. The chamber shook, the sound reverberating through the crumbling structure as the energy collided with its target. For an instant, everything was light. Then it was gone. The man staggered back, his breath unsteady, his vision clearing just enough to see. Nothing had changed. The stranger stood exactly where he had been, untouched, unmoved. The air around him was still, undisturbed by the force that had just been unleashed. Silence followed. It was deeper than before, heavier. The murmurs ceased, replaced by something more profound, the absence of explanation. The device in the man's hand flickered, then died. He stared at it, then at the figure before him, his mind searching for anything that could reconcile what he had just witnessed. "There are rules," he said, though the words sounded hollow now. "There is order." The stranger took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, yet it carried an undeniable weight. The man instinctively stepped back, the distance between them widening by instinct rather than decision. "Your rules," the stranger said, his voice calm. "Do not reach me." There was no arrogance in the statement. It was not a challenge, not a boast. It was simply true. The man's back met the edge of the chamber wall. For the first time, fear found him, not the abstract fear of doctrine, but something immediate, personal. His breath quickened, his thoughts faltered, and the structure of certainty he had relied upon began to collapse entirely. The stranger stopped a short distance away. He did not advance further. Instead, he looked past the man, his gaze sweeping over the kneeling figures who had not yet risen, who had not yet spoken. Their eyes were fixed on him now, no longer bound to the rituals that had defined them. "Why do you kneel?" he asked. The question was not directed at any one of them. It was cast into the room itself, into the space where belief had once filled every silence. No one answered. Not because they refused, but because they did not know how. The man, still pressed against the wall, found his voice in fragments. "Because we must," he said. The stranger's gaze returned to him. "Must," he repeated. The word lingered for a moment, then dissolved into something softer. "I see." He turned away. The motion was simple, unremarkable, yet it carried a finality greater than any act of violence. Without another word, he began to walk toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his presence undiminished. No one moved to stop him. No one could. As he passed through the threshold and into the ash-choked light beyond, the chamber remained frozen in silence. The rituals that had once filled it lay broken, their meaning unraveling in the wake of a single refusal. Outside, the world remained unchanged, but something within it had begun to shift, and it would not be contained again. The silence he left behind did not remain contained within the crumbling walls of that forgotten structure. It spread, not as sound, nor as motion, but as a subtle distortion in the unseen fabric that bound the world to something far greater and far more terrible. His presence, once confined to stone and soil, now moved freely beneath the open sky, and with each step he took, reality adjusted in ways too slight for mortals to perceive. But the warp noticed. It did not see as eyes see, nor hear as ears hear. It was a sea of thought and hunger, a realm where emotion shaped existence and existence fed upon emotion in return. It was chaos without end, yet within that chaos lay a terrible consistency. Everything within it belonged. Everything was part of its endless cycle of corruption and transformation. Everything except this. At first, the disturbance was faint. A ripple, no more significant than the passing echo of a dying mind. Countless such disturbances moved through the Imperium at every moment, born from the fears and desires of billions. They rose, twisted, and were consumed, their existence fleeting and inconsequential. But this ripple did not behave as it should. It did not dissolve. It did not distort. It remained. The entities that dwelled within the warp, those that had no form yet took countless shapes, shifted their awareness toward it, not in unison, not with purpose, but with instinct. They felt something that did not align with their nature, and in that misalignment there was unease. A presence without hunger, a will without corruption. It was not an absence, nor was it a void. It was something complete, something whole, moving through a reality that defined itself by fragmentation. The ripple grew, not in size but in clarity. It carved a path through the immaterium not by force but by indifference. The tides of the warp bent around it, unable to grasp or alter what they encountered. Where madness should have taken root, there was only stillness. And within that stillness, something laughed. The sound did not echo as it had in the material world. Here, it resonated differently, not carried by air but by thought itself. It moved through the currents of the warp as a concept rather than a noise, a presence that could not be silenced because it did not rely on any medium to exist. The entities recoiled. Not in fear, fear required understanding, but in confusion that bordered on something deeper. They reached toward the source, their forms shifting, stretching, attempting to envelop what they could not define. Their touch found nothing, or rather, it found something that did not respond. Where they expected resistance, there was none. Where they sought to corrupt, there was no change. It was as though they were grasping at a reflection that refused to mirror them, an anomaly that existed beyond the rules they embodied. The ripple did not retreat. It continued, steady and unyielding, moving through the immaterium with the same quiet certainty it had shown in the material world. It did not acknowledge the entities that circled it, nor did it react to their attempts to influence it. It simply was. On the surface of the dying world, the one who had emerged from stone walked on. He moved through the ruins without hesitation, his gaze shifting from structure to structure, from shadow to shadow. The world spoke to him in fragments, echoes of purpose, long abandoned, traces of intention buried beneath layers of decay. He listened, though not in the way the inhabitants of that world listened. He did not seek meaning in their words or their rituals. He observed the pattern beneath them, the shape of a system that had grown rigid with time. It was a world that had chosen stillness over change, obedience over curiosity. It did not interest him. But something else did. He paused. It was a subtle thing, almost imperceptible, yet it drew his attention as surely as any physical presence. The air did not shift, nor did the ground tremble, yet there was a sensation, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Something was watching, not from the ruins, nor from the sky above, from elsewhere. He tilted his head slightly, as though listening to a sound too quiet for others to hear. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in focus. The sensation did not carry intent in the way he understood it. It was diffuse, scattered, yet vast beyond measure. Curious. The corner of his mouth lifted. He did not look upward, nor did he seek the source. Instead, he took another step forward, continuing his path as though the observation itself was of little consequence. Yet, the connection remained. In the warp, the ripple encountered resistance for the first time. Not force, not opposition, but attention. Something vast had turned its awareness toward the anomaly. It did not approach directly, nor did it reveal itself in any singular form. It observed its presence pressing against the edges of the ripple without making contact. It sought to understand. But understanding required a framework, and this anomaly provided none. The ripple did not respond. It did not acknowledge the attention, nor did it alter its course. It moved as it had from the beginning, steady, unbound, untouched by the forces that defined the realm around it. And within it, the laughter came again. Softer this time, almost contemplative, as though the presence that had noticed it was not something to be feared, nor even something to be challenged, merely something new. On the surface, the figure stopped once more. His gaze lifted slightly, not to the sky, but beyond it towards something that could not be seen. For a brief moment, there was stillness, a pause that carried no tension, no anticipation. Then he exhaled, slow and measured. "Stranger still," he murmured. The words were quiet, yet they carried the same weight as before, not imposed, not declared, but simply existing as truth. He lowered his gaze and continued walking. Behind him, the world remained unchanged. Before him, it waited. And far beyond, in the shifting madness of the warp, something that had never known uncertainty began, for the first time, to question. The watchers did not remain still after his passing. What had unfolded within the shattered chamber could not be folded back into silence, nor buried beneath ritual, as so many disruptions had been before. The absence he left behind was louder than any command, and in that absence fear found its purpose again. Signals were sent, not as pleas, nor as questions, but as declarations of anomaly. The language of the transmission was rigid, stripped of interpretation, shaped by centuries of doctrine that allowed no room for uncertainty. Her presence had manifested beyond classification. It had resisted correction. It had departed uncontained. That alone was enough. They came before the ash had time to settle. The enforcers descended not from the sky in blazing fury, but with the cold precision of inevitability. Their arrival was marked by the distant hum of engines that did not belong to the decayed silence of the world, followed by the steady march of armored figures whose purpose had long since replaced individuality. They did not question. They did not hesitate. They followed the path left behind, tracing the disturbance not through sight, but through deviation. Where the world had shifted, where patterns had broken, where silence had been altered, they found him. He did not hide. When they approached, he stood upon the edge of a fractured roadway, his gaze cast toward the distant horizon. The ruins stretched endlessly before him, yet his attention seemed fixed on something beyond them, something not yet visible. The first of the enforcers raised a weapon. It was not the crude instrument wielded within the chamber, but something far more deliberate. Its design spoke not of correction, but of eradication and extension of a system that did not seek to understand what lay outside its boundaries. "Identify," the enforcer commanded. The voice was filtered, stripped of tone, carrying only the authority of function. The figure turned slightly, acknowledging the presence without urgency. "I have been called many things," he said. The answer did not satisfy. "Designation required," the enforcer replied. The weapon remained steady, its aim unwavering. The faintest trace of amusement touched the stranger's expression. "You may choose one," he said. The response was not processed as humor. The enforcers advanced. There were no further words. The command to act was not spoken aloud. It passed between them in silence, an unbroken chain of purpose. Weapons discharged in unison, streams of controlled destruction converging upon a single point. The air fractured with the force of it. Where the energy struck, the world itself seemed to recoil, the ground blackening, the air distorting under the weight of applied violence. It was not a test. It was an execution carried out with absolute certainty. And yet, when the light cleared, he remained. Not untouched, for the concept of impact had reached him, but unchanged. The energy had met him as rain meets stone, leaving no mark that could be measured, no alteration that could be recorded. The enforcers did not falter. They adjusted. Weapons shifted, recalibrating, their output intensifying as they sought to align force with resistance. They closed the distance, their movements precise, synchronized, unyielding. The figure stepped forward to meet them. The motion was effortless. The first enforcer struck, the butt of his weapon driving toward the stranger's form with calculated force. It did not land. Not because it was deflected, nor because it was avoided. It simply failed to connect. The stranger's movement was too slight to follow, too subtle to measure. He was no longer where the strike had been aimed, yet he had not moved in any way that could be defined. He stood beside the enforcer now, his hand resting lightly against the armored surface. There was no visible exertion. The enforcer collapsed, not violently, not with the chaos of broken machinery, but as though the force that held him upright had simply been removed. He fell to the ground in silence, his weapon slipping from his grasp. The others responded instantly. They adapted, their formation shifting, their assault intensifying. Blades were drawn, their edges humming with contained energy, designed to sever not only flesh, but the essence that animated it. They struck, and one by one they fell. There was no pattern to it that they could discern, no sequence they could analyze or counter. Each movement they made was answered before it was completed, each strike rendered meaningless before it could find its mark. The stranger did not rush. He did not pursue. He simply existed within the space they occupied, and within that existence, their actions lost coherence. When the last of them fell, the silence returned. It settled over the broken roadway, heavy and complete. The armored forms lay scattered, their purpose extinguished without spectacle, without resistance that could be named. The figure stood among them. For a moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled softly, as though concluding a thought that had never fully formed. "They try very hard," he murmured. The words were not unkind. They carried a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of effort, though not of success. The stillness did not last. From beyond the ruins, a new presence emerged, not in haste, not with the brute force of the enforcers, but with a measured, deliberate approach. Figures robed in the symbols of faith and authority, their forms adorned with relics that spoke of ancient judgment. They did not carry weapons in the same manner. Their power was of a different kind. They formed a circle around him, their movements slow, precise, each step part of a ritual that had been performed countless times before. Their voices rose in unison, chanting words that resonated not only in the air, but in something deeper, something that touched the edges of the warp itself. The space around them shifted. Light bent, shadows deepened, and the air grew dense with unseen force. Symbols etched into their garments began to glow faintly, their meaning lost to time but their function intact. The stranger watched. There was no resistance in him, no immediate response. He allowed the circle to form, allowed the ritual to take shape, his gaze moving from one figure to the next with quiet interest. "You will be judged," one of them declared. The voice was not loud, yet it carried an authority that surpassed mere sound. The stranger tilted his head. "Judged," he repeated. The word lingered, as it had before, turning slowly in the space between them. Then he smiled. The ritual reached its peak. The air collapsed inward, the force of their combined will converging upon him, seeking to bind, to define, to place him within the structure they had built their existence upon. For a moment, it seemed to take hold. The light closed around him, the symbols flaring brighter, the weight of their judgment pressing down with undeniable force. Then, it stopped. Not broken, not resisted. Stopped. As though the very concept of binding had encountered something that did not acknowledge its existence. The light dimmed. The symbols flickered. The chanting faltered. The circle remained, but its meaning had been stripped away. The stranger stood at its center, unchanged. "Your court is incomplete," he said softly. No one answered, because for the first time, the ones who judged did not know how. The circle did not break, though its purpose had already collapsed. Those who stood within it felt the absence before they understood it. The symbols etched into their robes dimmed to lifeless marks, their faint glow reduced to nothing more than memory. The air, once thick with ritual intent, thinned again into the dead stillness of the world. Yet they did not move. They remained where they were, held not by power, but by the inertia of belief. At the center he stood unchanged. The faint smile upon his face did not widen, nor did it fade. It remained as it had since the moment their judgment had failed, an expression not of victory, but of quiet recognition. He had seen this before, in forms different yet fundamentally the same, systems that believed themselves eternal, confronted by something that did not acknowledge their boundaries. One of the robed figures took a step forward. The movement was small, hesitant in a way that none of them had ever been before. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the strain of holding together a certainty that had begun to unravel. "This is not possible," he said. The words were not directed at the stranger, nor at the others within the circle. They were spoken into the space itself, as though reality might hear them and correct its course. The stranger regarded him calmly. "Yet it is," he replied. There was no emphasis, no insistence. The statement required none. The robed figure's breath caught. His gaze shifted, searching the faces of those around him, seeking confirmation, denial, anything that might restore the structure that had defined his existence. He found only the same uncertainty reflected back at him. "We have bound things far greater than you," another voice said. This one was steadier, though it carried an edge sharpened by desperation. The speaker stood rigid, his posture reinforced by the weight of countless rites performed without failure. Things that defied reason, things that consumed worlds. The stranger's eyes moved to him. "And did they remain?" he asked. The question settled heavily. No answer came, because the truth of it was known, though never spoken. The things they had bound, the things they had judged and contained, had never truly ceased. They lingered in the edges of reality, in the shadows of the warp, in the endless war that defined the existence of all who served the distant throne. Containment was not victory. It was delay. The silence deepened. The stranger shifted his weight slightly, his gaze drifting upward for a brief moment, not toward the sky but beyond it. There was something there still, something watching, something vast and patient. He felt it as one might feel the presence of a storm long before it broke. He exhaled softly. Then he laughed. The sound cut through the stillness with effortless clarity. It was not loud, yet it carried farther than any voice within that ruined place. It did not echo against the broken structures, nor fade into the ash-choked air. It simply existed, undeniable and complete. The robed figures flinched. Not outwardly, not in any way they would have recognized as fear, but something within them recoiled. The laughter did not belong to madness, nor to despair. It was not the laughter of those they had been taught to oppose. It was something else, something free. "You bind," the stranger said, the laughter fading into quiet words. "You judge, you kneel to something you cannot see, and call it eternal." He took a slow step forward. None of them moved to stop him. "And yet," he continued, "you have never asked if it deserves it." The words struck deeper than any force they had attempted to wield. One of them raised his voice, not in command, but in protest. "We do not ask," he said. "We serve." The stranger's gaze settled on him, steady and unyielding. "Then you have chosen your chains." There was no accusation in the statement, only truth. The circle began to dissolve, not physically, but in meaning. The formation that had once defined their authority lost its cohesion, its purpose unraveling under the weight of doubt. One by one, they stepped back, not in retreat, but in uncertainty, as though the space they occupied no longer held the same significance. The stranger moved through them. No barrier rose to meet him. No hand reached out to restrain him. They parted without intention, their movements guided by something they did not understand. As he passed, the air shifted slightly, the faintest trace of motion brushing against them. It was not force, it was not power as they knew it. It was presence. He stepped beyond the circle, leaving them behind. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then, quietly, one of them fell to his knees. The motion was instinctive, a return to something familiar. But it was not the same as before. The ritual had been broken, its certainty fractured. What remained was not devotion, but something closer to uncertainty. Others followed. Not all, but enough. They knelt not in unison, not in perfect synchronization, but in scattered, uneven motion. Their voices did not rise in chant. No words came, only silence. Behind them, the stranger did not look back. He continued forward, his path unbroken, his steps unhurried. The ruins stretched endlessly before him, yet there was no sense of aimlessness in his movement. He was not wandering. He was exploring. Above, the sky remained unchanged, its oppressive weight pressing down upon a world that had long since abandoned the idea of ascent. But something had shifted, not in the sky, not in the ruins, in those who remained behind. The laughter lingered with them, not as sound, but as memory, a reminder that something existed beyond the structures they had built, beyond the chains they had accepted, something that did not kneel. And far beyond, in the shifting depths of the warp, the echo of that laughter spread once more unfettered, unclaimed, and utterly beyond the reach of eternity. The laughter did not end when it faded from mortal hearing. It endured in subtler ways, threading through the unseen currents that bound the Imperium together. What had begun as a disturbance upon a forgotten world now extended far beyond its surface, carried not by signal or word, but by presence alone. It moved through the warp, not as corruption, nor as echo, but as something wholly intact. And in a place where all things were broken, that wholeness did not go unnoticed. Far from the decaying planet, beyond countless systems locked in endless war and devotion, there existed a world that had not known silence for 10,000 years. Its skies were choked not with ash, but with the constant passage of vessels bearing pilgrims, soldiers, and the dying. Its surface was layered with monuments built upon monuments, a testament to a faith that had consumed entire civilizations. At its heart, within a structure that dwarfed all others, there was a throne. It was not a seat of comfort, nor of rule as mortals understood it. It was a machine of unimaginable complexity, sustained by rituals so ancient that their origins had been lost even to those who performed them. It was both life and death, preservation and decay, holding together something that should have long since ceased. Upon it, a presence endured. It did not move. It did not speak. It existed. For ages beyond counting, it had remained unchanged, its will extended across the Imperium not through voice, but through the fragile network of minds that dared to reach into the warp. It was a beacon, a force of cohesion against the endless tides of madness that sought to consume all things. It was constant. Until now, the shift was not visible. No alarm sounded within the vast halls that surrounded the throne. The countless attendants who moved in practiced ritual noticed nothing amiss. The machinery continued its ceaseless function, the flow of sacrifice uninterrupted, the systems of preservation unwavering. Yet something had altered. Within the immaterium, where the presence of the throne burned as a singular, unyielding point of light, a distortion formed. Not an intrusion, not an attack, but a deviation so subtle it might have been overlooked had it not persisted. The laughter reached it, not as sound, but as an idea. It brushed against the vast, silent will that had endured for millennia, and for the briefest of moments, something within that will responded, not with movement, not with thought as mortals would understand it, but with recognition. It was not the recognition of an equal, nor of an enemy. It was something far more uncertain. On the distant world, the one who had emerged from stone continued his path. He had left the broken court behind without hesitation, the echoes of their doubt fading into the background of a place that no longer held his interest. The ruins shifted around him as he moved, their patterns revealing themselves slowly, piece by piece. He was beginning to understand, not the specifics of their systems, nor the intricacies of their rituals, but the shape of their existence. It was a world bound by something unseen, something vast enough to dictate the actions of billions without ever revealing itself fully. He had felt such things before. He had defied them. He paused again, his gaze lifting slightly. The sensation returned, not the diffuse observation of the warp, but something more focused. A presence vast beyond measure, yet contained, restrained by forces that were not entirely its own. It was distant, yet it touched everything. His expression shifted, the faint smile fading into something more contemplative. For the first time since his awakening, there was a hint of something new in his gaze. Interest, sharpened. He could not see it. Not yet. But he could feel its weight, its reach extending across the void, pressing against the edges of reality itself. It was not like the things that stirred within the warp, not chaotic, not fragmented. It was singular, bound. He tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something that had not yet spoken. Far away, upon the throne, the presence remained still. It did not reach out. It did not act. Yet the distortion persisted, the faint trace of something that did not belong brushing against its awareness again and again. It was not an assault, nor a challenge. It was simply there, unyielding, unaffected by the forces that shaped all else. For an instant so brief that no measure of time could contain it, the vast will upon the throne wavered. Not in strength, in certainty. The moment passed. The systems held. The silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence. On the distant world, the figure lowered his gaze. The faint smile returned, though it carried a different weight now. Not amusement alone, but anticipation. "Ah," he murmured softly. The word was quiet, almost lost beneath the dead air of the ruined world. Yet it marked something significant, not an end, but the beginning of recognition. He took another step forward. The path ahead remained unclear, the ruins stretching endlessly, the sky unchanged in its oppressive stillness. Yet something beyond it had acknowledged him, however briefly. And that was enough. Far across the stars the throne endured, unmoving, unyielding, silent. Yet within that silence, something had stirred, not as a voice, not as a command, but as the faintest fracture in eternity itself. And fractures, once formed, do not remain contained. The fracture did not close. It lingered in the silence between distant awareness and present motion, an unseen thread connecting a dying world to something far greater. Yet on the surface of that world, there was no stillness left to preserve. The quiet that had defined its decay was breaking, not from within, but from beyond. War had come. It did not arrive with warning. The first sign was the sky itself. What had long remained a suffocating veil of ash and dim light began to shift, its oppressive stillness disturbed by distant movement. Shapes formed within the clouded expanse, vast and angular, descending with deliberate inevitability. They did not pierce the sky with fire or spectacle. They emerged from it as though they had always been there, waiting to be seen. Then came the sound. Low at first, a distant tremor that rolled across the plains like the memory of thunder. It grew steadily, deepening into a sustained resonance that vibrated through the bones of the world itself. The ruins responded, their fragile structures shuddering under the weight of approaching force. The inhabitants felt it. Those who had remained hidden within the hollowed remnants of their existence stirred from their rituals, their routines broken once more. But this disruption was different from the one that had come before. It was familiar. It was expected. They did not question it. They prepared. From the depths of manufactorums long thought dormant, machines awakened with reluctant obedience. Ancient engines roared to life, their mechanisms grinding against centuries of neglect. Weapons were unearthed, their forms crude yet functional, wielded by hands that had never known peace. The world did not resist the war. It accepted it. At the edge of a broken ridge, he stood and watched. The descent continued, the shapes in the sky resolving into vessels of immense scale, their surfaces marked with symbols of authority and conquest. They did not hover, they did not hesitate. One by one, they lowered toward the surface, their arrival displacing the air with a force that sent waves of ash rolling across the plains. He observed without concern. There was no tension in him, no readiness for conflict as the world understood it. The gathering storm held his attention, but not his focus. It was another pattern, another expression of a system he had begun to recognize. Below, the first impact came, not from the sky but from the ground. A distant structure collapsed inward as something tore through it from beneath, its emergence violent and unrestrained. Metal twisted, stone shattered, and from the wreckage rose forms that did not belong to the world as it had been. They were not human, nor were they entirely alien. Their shapes were wrong in ways that defied simple description, their movements too fluid, too erratic, as though guided by instincts that did not align with physical reality. They surged forward without formation, without command, driven by a singular purpose that needed no articulation. The defenders met them. Lines formed across the broken plains, weapons raised, voices lifted not in fear, but in repetition. Orders were given, executed, and lost within the chaos as the two forces collided. The first clash was immediate. There was no hesitation, no negotiation. Energy tore through the air, cutting through forms that dissolved upon impact, only to be replaced by more. Blades met flesh that resisted in unnatural ways, strikes landing without the expected result, as though the very concept of injury had been altered. The war unfolded without structure. It did not progress. It did not shift. It simply continued. He watched. His gaze moved slowly across the battlefield, taking in the motion, the repetition, the endless exchange of force without resolution. There was no strategy he could discern, no clear objective that guided either side. It was conflict without conclusion. He stepped forward. The movement was unremarkable, yet it carried him toward the edge of the unfolding chaos. The ground beneath him trembled with the impact of distant strikes, the air thick with the residue of energy and destruction. Still, he walked. A figure broke from the melee ahead, stumbling across the fractured terrain. It was one of the defenders, its armor scorched, its movements unsteady. It did not see him at first, its focus fixed on escape rather than direction. Then it looked up. For a moment, it froze. There was no recognition in its gaze, only the instinctive response to something out of place. It raised its weapon, not in aggression, but in reflex. "Fall back," it said, the words strained, fragmented. "You cannot stand here." He regarded the figure briefly. "Why not?" he asked. The question was simple. The answer did not come. Because behind the soldier, the war continued, unchanged by their exchange. The clash of forces did not diminish, did not shift to acknowledge the presence of something new. It simply persisted. The soldier hesitated, its grip tightening on the weapon. "This does not end," it said finally. The words were not a warning. They were a statement of fact. The stranger's gaze drifted past the soldier, back to the battlefield where forms clashed and fell without resolution. For a moment he said nothing. Then, softly, he exhaled. "I see." He stepped past the soldier. The motion was calm, unhurried, as though he were entering a place of quiet rather than chaos. The soldier did not stop him. It could not. The act of resistance had already lost its meaning. He walked into the war. Around him, the clash continued, forces colliding with relentless repetition. Energy surged, blades struck, forms rose and fell in an endless cycle that consumed everything within its reach. Yet where he moved, something shifted. Not in the war itself, but in its perception. The patterns began to unravel, not collapsing, but revealing their emptiness. The motions that had seemed purposeful now appeared hollow, their repetition stripped of meaning. He moved through it, untouched. Not ignored, not unseen, but unacknowledged in a way that defied comprehension. The forces that clashed around him did not alter their course, did not turn their attention toward him. It was as though he existed outside the conflict entirely. At the center of the battlefield, he stopped. The war raged on, unending, unchanging. He looked around once more, taking in the endless cycle, the absence of resolution, the certainty of continuation. Then, quietly, he laughed. And for the first time since the battle began, something within it faltered. The falter was not visible at first. It did not manifest as a break in formation, nor as a pause in the endless exchange of violence. The war continued in its accustomed rhythm, its forces locked in cycles of advance and collapse. Yet within that rhythm, something subtle had changed, an imbalance too slight to name but too real to ignore. He stood at its center. The laughter had already faded, leaving behind a silence that did not belong to any side of the conflict. Around him, the battlefield persisted in its contradiction, machines of war advancing without end, bodies reforming from ruin, commands shouted into noise that refused to carry meaning. And yet the repetition was no longer absolute. He could see it now, not as chaos, but as structure pretending to be inevitability. A line broke nearby, not in the sense of retreat or collapse, but in hesitation. A formation that had held steady through countless cycles of destruction wavered as its focus shifted, however briefly, toward the presence that should not have existed within it. A warrior turned. It was not the same as the soldier he had spoken to before. This one carried authority not borrowed, but enforced. Its armor was heavier, its silhouette marked with insignia that had survived centuries of reinterpretation without losing meaning. Where others fought as function, this one fought as doctrine given form. It saw him. The recognition was immediate, not of identity, but of disruption. The warrior did not speak. It did not question. Its response was instantaneous, as though the act of recognition itself demanded correction. It advanced. The ground beneath its steps fractured with controlled precision, each movement calibrated to dominance rather than speed. Unlike the others, this one did not flail within the war. It shaped its portion of it. The stranger turned slightly. His expression did not change. "You are different," he said. The warrior stopped within striking distance. Its voice, when it came, was filtered through layers of command and ritual reinforcement. All difference is deviation. The statement carried finality. It was not an opinion. It was law. The stranger nodded once, as though considering the shape of the thought. "Then you have many enemies," he replied. The warrior raised its weapon. This was not the crude enforcement tool of lesser ranks. It was refined, ancient, and maintained through generations of doctrine that treated its function as sacred. It did not fire immediately. It assessed. It calculated. It confirmed alignment with every known parameter of threat classification, and found none that matched. That alone should have caused hesitation. It did not. Instead, it corrected the anomaly by redefining it. The weapon discharged. The strike was not meant to destroy flesh alone. It was designed to sever continuity, to erase the concept of persistence within its target, to ensure that what stood before it could not continue to exist in any meaningful form. The energy struck. The air folded. For the first time since the battle began, something in the field reacted with awareness. Not resistance. Awareness. The stranger did not move, but the strike did not complete its function. It stalled at the boundary of his presence, as though encountering a rule that refused to be rewritten. The energy did not explode, nor did it dissipate. It remained suspended for a fraction of a moment that felt longer than the war itself. Then it fell away. Not defeated. Dismissed. The warrior paused. It recalculated. There was no record for this outcome. No doctrine for failure without contact. No instruction for absence of effect. The stranger stepped forward. The motion was small, but it redefined the space between them. The war around them continued, yet it no longer reached this point with clarity. The cycles of violence bent outward, avoiding the center, as though uncertain whether it still existed. The warrior struck again. Faster. Stronger. Absolute. And again, it failed. The second failure was not identical to the first. It carried weight. The warrior hesitated. A hesitation so small it would not be recorded by any system built to interpret certainty. Yet within it, something fractured not in the machine, but in the assumption that governed it. The stranger looked at the weapon, then at the warrior. "Do you understand it?" he asked. The question was not challenging. It was simple. The warrior did not respond immediately. It had no instruction for this. Understanding was not required for enforcement. It defaulted to doctrine. "I understand obedience," it said. The stranger's gaze softened slightly, though not with pity. "With no understanding," he said, "obedience is only repetition." The word repetition altered something in the air. Not physically. Structurally. The war behind them faltered again. A unit nearby stopped mid-motion. Not in collapse, but in interruption. A cycle had failed to complete, then another, then another. The pattern was breaking, not destroyed. Questioned. The warrior sensed it. Its stance tightened. For the first time, its certainty did not reinforce itself. "You are error," it declared. The stranger nodded slowly. "I am what remains when your rules stop reaching." The warrior raised its weapon once more, but this time there was hesitation. Not in aim, in purpose. Behind it, the war continued but unevenly now, its rhythm disturbed by something it could not fully correct. The stranger took one final step closer. Now they stood within the same space the war could no longer fully define. The warrior did not fire, not because it could not, because something within its structure no longer aligned the act with certainty. The stranger looked at it for a long moment. Then he spoke softly. "Kings do not bow," he said. The warrior did not understand the reference, but something within it recognized the implication. Authority without certainty, command without inevitability. And for the first time, within the endless machine of war that had never stopped, something very small began to fail. Not the war, not yet, but the belief that it could never end. The hesitation did not remain confined to the battlefield. It spread, not as signal or command, but as discontinuity and interruption in the assumption that reality would continue to behave as it always had. Across the war-torn surface, forces that had long operated on reflexive certainty began to diverge from their patterns. The cycles did not break. They drifted. Within the immaterium, the disturbance deepened. It was no longer a ripple, nor even an echo of presence. It had become a structure of its own, moving through the warp without surrendering to its currents. Where once there had been curiosity, there was now something more focused, something that observed, not from distance, but from recognition. The entities that inhabited that realm had ceased their attempts to define it. Definition required containment. Containment required influence. Influence required contact. None of these held. Instead, they watched. And in watching, they began to change. The warp had endured countless intrusions across its existence. It had swallowed gods, shattered civilizations, dissolved meaning itself into endless transformation. Nothing within it remained unchanged for long. Everything bent, twisted, or was consumed. But this thing did not arrive as intrusion. It arrived as absence of transformation. It moved through the currents without becoming part of them. And that was new. A presence within the warp shifted its attention more fully than before. It was vast, older than memory, formed from the accumulated weight of belief and terror across ages uncounted. It did not think in linear form. It did not act with intent, as mortals understood it. It simply extended awareness. The anomaly did not recoil. It did not respond. It continued. On the material world, the stranger stood before the warrior who had once represented absolute certainty. Around them, the war continued in fractured rhythm, its coherence unraveling in widening circles that no command could restore. The warrior had not fired. That fact alone had already altered the battlefield more than any strike. Its weapon remained raised, but no longer with inevitability. The motion was sustained by structure alone, not conviction. Within its systems, calculations continued, but their outputs no longer aligned with action. The stranger watched it quietly. Then he looked past it, beyond the battlefield, beyond the collapsing patterns of conflict, beyond the world itself, as though something else had spoken without words. In the warp, something moved closer. Not quickly, not cautiously, but inevitably. It did not seek confrontation. It sought resolution. The anomaly, this presence that did not conform, had been observed long enough. Its persistence had shifted from curiosity to structural concern, not because it threatened destruction, but because it refused assimilation. And in a realm defined by endless transformation, refusal was indistinguishable from imbalance. Imbalance demanded correction, but correction required interaction, and interaction required risk. The warp had not known risk in this form. The pressure around the anomaly increased, not as force, but as expectation. Reality within the immaterium bent subtly, attempting to reassert interpretive control. Shapes formed around it, conceptual structures, half-born intelligences, echoes of ancient hungers given temporary coherence. They reached, not as attack, as comprehension. The anomaly did not change, and so the warp responded the only way it understood. It listened more closely. On the surface, the stranger tilted his head again. A faint narrowing of his eyes suggested recognition of something not present in the physical world. "You are nearer now," he murmured. The warrior in front of him did not react. It could not perceive what lay beyond its assigned reality, but something within its structure registered the shift regardless, a pressure it could not classify. The stranger stepped back slightly, not in retreat, in acknowledgement. The war around them did not notice this subtle shift immediately. It continued in its broken rhythm, unaware that its foundation was no longer singular. That beneath it, something else had begun to press upward through the layers of reality. The warp did not fear. It did not possess fear as a concept. But within its vast, shifting awareness, something unprecedented occurred. Recognition without assimilation, presence without change, a thing that did not belong yet could not be removed. And in that impossibility, the first deviation from eternity began to take shape. The entities within the warp recoiled again, not from pain, nor from threat, but from contradiction. They had no framework for what did not bend, no language for what did not respond. For the first time in its endless existence, the warp did not immediately consume what it could not define. It hesitated, and in that hesitation, Something like fear began to form not as emotion, but as structural uncertainty. The stranger looked upward again, as though sensing the shift across both realms at once. His expression remained calm, but the smile had returned. Not wider, not sharper. Certain. The distance is closing, he said softly. The words carried no triumph, only acknowledgement. Behind him, the warrior finally lowered its weapon a fraction. Not in surrender, not in defeat, but because the command that sustained it no longer aligned cleanly with certainty. And somewhere beyond both worlds, in the vast and roiling immensity of the warp, something ancient and unyielding began to understand a truth it had never encountered before. Not all things could be rewritten. Some things remained. And that possibility, more than any war, more than any god, was what the warp had begun, for the first time, to fear. The hesitation within the warp did not remain localized. It spread outward in ways that defied conventional movement, not traveling through space, but through recognition itself. Wherever the anomaly had touched awareness, something within the structure of perception failed to resolve cleanly. The immaterium, once endlessly fluid in its certainty of consumption and change, now carried a growing pattern of unresolved presence. And at the center of all human dominion, something watched. It did not look. It did not turn. It did not shift its attention as mortals would understand it. It simply became aware, in a way that encompassed everything at once. Upon the throne of perpetual suffering, the presence that had endured for 10 millennia remained still. Its physical form, bound to ancient mechanisms and impossible sustenance, showed no change. The countless systems that sustained it continued their ritual function without deviation. The servants who maintained the structure observed no anomaly within their limited perception. Yet within the deeper layers of existence, where thought replaced sight, the awareness of the throne extended outward. It felt the warp differently now, not as storm, not as threat, but as something that had encountered resistance without resolution. That was not new. The Imperium had faced countless incursions from the immaterium. It had withstood invasions, breaches, possessions, and collapses that would have annihilated lesser civilizations. Every form of chaos had been catalogued in suffering, every manifestation of the warp understood through endless war. But this was not chaos. This was continuity without corruption. The anomaly had not entered the warp as a force of destruction or temptation. It had entered as presence that did not bend. And now it had been observed long enough to register as deviation rather than anomaly. Within the silent consciousness upon the throne, something shifted not physically, but in the arrangement of awareness itself. The vast network of human psychic transmission that stretched across the Imperium carried fragments of this disturbance back toward its origin, though none among the living psychers understood what they conveyed. Messages without language, signals without structure, a name without form. The distant world where the anomaly walked flickered briefly in the perception of the throne. Not visually, not directly, but as an intersection point where countless threads of reality failed to align. There, war still fractured itself in broken cycles. There, machines continued their endless repetition of violence. There, certainty eroded in subtle, accumulating layers. And there, the one who did not bend continued forward. The presence upon the throne focused further. It did not act. Action required definition. And definition required consequence. For the first time in ages measured beyond mortal comprehension, there was something that could not be classified as enemy, ally, or tool. It existed outside the structure that had been enforced upon reality through sacrifice and survival. The silence of the throne deepened, not in absence of thought, in compression of it. Far below, across the countless war zones of the Imperium, psychers collapsed mid-transmission. Astropaths screamed without sound, their minds brushing against something that did not echo in return. Entire systems flickered as psychic conduits briefly aligned with the same unresolved signal. Something was approaching awareness on a scale that did not fit any known paradigm. And still, the anomaly moved closer to the center of all things. On the broken battlefield, the warrior had fully lowered its weapon now, not by command, not by defeat, but because the certainty that sustained its function had fractured beyond immediate repair. Around it, the war continued, but unevenly, as though reality itself had begun to forget which patterns it was meant to preserve. The stranger stood still for a moment, as if listening to something beyond hearing. Then he exhaled. "I can see it now," he said quietly. "Not the throne. Not the war. Something behind both. A structure of will so vast it had become indistinguishable from existence itself." The warp trembled again, not in fear, not yet fully, but in recognition that what watched it was not passive. It had noticed. And in that noticing, the distance between the throne and the anomaly collapsed by a fraction that could not be measured, only felt. The throne did not move, but it no longer remained unchanged. And somewhere within that infinite silence, a question formed that had never existed before. Not spoken, not thought, simply present. What is this thing that does not yield? The question did not dissipate. It remained within the structure of awareness that had formed around the throne, not as spoken thought, but as a fixed point of unresolved inquiry. For the first time since its existence had been bound to sacrifice and silence, something had emerged that did not resolve into doctrine. And across the collapsing distances of reality, the answer approached. On the broken world, the stranger had stopped walking, not because he was obstructed, but because the path ahead had changed in nature. The battlefield no longer felt like mere conflict. The war had thinned, its repetition stretching outward as though losing coherence the closer it came to a singular point. He stood at its edge. Beyond it, something vast pressed against existence itself. The warrior who had once embodied certainty remained nearby, now entirely still, its weapon hung lowered, no longer active in intent. Around them, the war continued, but as background rather than structure, its relevance diminished in the presence of something larger. The stranger lifted his gaze. For the first time since his awakening, he did not smile, not because he had lost amusement, but because what stood before him no longer fit within the language of reaction. It was not the warp alone that he felt now. It was something beyond even that fractured realm, something that used it as a medium rather than a form. A will, boundless yet constrained, enduring yet unyielding, and aware. The distance between them collapsed, not in space, but in recognition. On the throne, the presence did not move, but its awareness aligned fully with the anomaly for the first time. Across existence, every psychic thread that bound humanity to its distant center trembled as if pulled taut. The Imperium did not understand what was happening. Its instruments recorded only distortion, its psychers only overwhelming pressure, its servants only silence where guidance should have been. But within that silence something had formed. The stranger took a step forward, not into battle, not into ritual, into acknowledgement. The warp recoiled and pressed simultaneously, unable to resolve what was occurring. It had never served as conduit for meeting, only for distortion. Yet now it was becoming something else entirely, a bridge that neither side had constructed, but both now occupied. The presence upon the throne did not extend itself. It did not reach. It did not command. It simply existed with full awareness of the anomaly standing at the far end of its perception. And for the first time in 10,000 years of unbroken vigilance, it was met by something that did not kneel, did not corrupt, and did not vanish under its gaze. The stranger spoke, not aloud in any conventional sense, but in a way that crossed the same impossible distance the throne occupied. "You are not what I expected," he said. The words were not challenge, not reverence, not defiance. They were observation. Within the throne's silent awareness, the concept of response formed, but did not yet take shape as action. It had faced gods that demanded worship, monsters that demanded fear, and voids that demanded surrender. This was neither. This was encounter. On the battlefield below, all conflict had slowed without command, not halted but stretched, as though reality itself was uncertain whether it should continue without guidance from the center it now orbited. The warrior finally stepped back, not retreating, yielding space to something it could not interpret. The stranger moved again, closer now. Each step did not shorten distance but refine perception. The throne was no longer far, it was no longer distant, it was present in the same conceptual space as the one who walked. And still it did not move. Then, within the silence that had defined eternity, something shifted. Not speech, not command, but recognition completed. Two wills, each impossible in its own way, now occupied the same point of awareness across reality. One bound to suffering, holding an empire together through unending sacrifice. One unbound, existing without submission to any known structure. Neither advanced, neither yielded. And in that stillness, the universe itself seemed to hesitate, as though unsure which of them was meant to define the next moment. The meeting had begun, and nothing that followed would remain unchanged. The moment did not resolve. It lingered, suspended between two impossibilities that neither could diminish. The stranger stood at the threshold of awareness that stretched beyond reality, while the presence upon the throne remained fixed in its eternal burden. Between them, space and meaning folded into a stillness that had no precedent in either existence. The warp did not surge. It did not collapse. It watched. For the first time in its endless becoming, it was not merely a medium of corruption or reflection. It had become a witness to something that did not belong to it, something that refused to be absorbed into its endless cycle of transformation. And within that witness, something remained unchanged. The laughter. It did not echo as it had before. It did not travel as sound or concept. It existed as residue, a lingering truth that neither presence could erase. It moved through the boundary between them, not bridging it, but tracing it, marking the shape of a connection that defied all prior structure. The stranger felt it first, not as amusement, not as defiance, but as continuity, a reminder that his existence had not been altered by the encounter, nor had it been diminished by the scale of what he now faced. He remained what he had always been, unyielding in presence, unbound in motion, unchanged by recognition. He exhaled slowly. The sound was almost imperceptible, yet within it lay a final acknowledgement. "This is not a throne," he said quietly. The words carried across the impossible distance without resistance. Within the silent consciousness upon the golden throne, there was no reply in language. There never had been. Yet something within it registered the statement, not as rejection, but as definition. A thing that does not move is not necessarily power. It is burden. The distinction settled across the unseen architecture of the Imperium, though none within it could comprehend the shift. The systems continued. The war continued. The endless machinery of survival and sacrifice remained intact, but the meaning beneath it had begun to loosen. On the broken world, the battlefield had not resumed its prior certainty. The cycles of war still unfolded, yet their cohesion was fractured. Commands no longer aligned perfectly with execution. Strikes no longer followed predictable resolution. The presence that had stood at the center of all interpretation had altered the conditions under which interpretation itself functioned. The warrior who had once embodied certainty now stood apart, unmoving. Its weapon remained lowered, not in surrender, but in irrelevance. Around it, the conflict persisted, but it no longer anchored itself to singular truth. The stranger turned slightly, as though preparing to depart. But he did not leave. Not yet, because the silence from the throne had changed. It was no longer absence. It was attention held without response. And within that held attention, something else emerged. Not command, not question, but persistence. The laughter returned once more, softer than before, not directed at the throne, not directed at the warp, but existing alongside them, as though acknowledging that neither eternity nor defiance could erase the other. The warp trembled, not in fear, not fully, but in recognition that the encounter had not concluded. It had only stabilized into a new, unfamiliar equilibrium. And within that equilibrium, something had survived unchanged. The stranger smiled again, not broadly, not triumphantly, but as one who had confirmed a truth already suspected. "You remain," he said. No answer came, yet the silence itself carried weight now, because it was no longer empty. It was shared. Far beyond the world, beyond the storm of the warp, beyond even the reach of human understanding, the throne endured. The stranger remained, and between them, the laughter lingered, not as victory, not as defeat, but as proof that neither will had been erased. And in a universe built upon endings, that was the one thing that did not fade.